abbreviated version of it, but basically a part 2 to Rule 7. And Scott's going to do more than just wink and nod and
grunt and nod.
Yeah. I mean, laugh at my jokes. That would be helpful, but preferably more than that.
Oh, I will do my honest best.
I'm sure you will. So,
which doesn't say a lot these days, but
so there's this. The thing that really kind of made me go, "Hey, wait a second, we gotta keep going on this." Is really how he digs deep into Christianity in a way that I think is pretty helpful. I think we ended, I mentioned this quote from Carl Jung, no tree can grow to heaven unless its roots reach down to hell, and sort of this recognition of sort of the evil within human beings, and we've sort of beaten that thing to death, so I'm not looking to go back into that. But then he goes into the temptation of Jesus, sort of a background a little bit actually first before Christ, talking about religion in general and some of these other gods from like ancient Egypt, and sort of this battle between good and evil. And then leading that into how Satan first tempts the starving Christ to quell his hunger by transforming the desert rocks into bread. And remember, this is pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. It's delayed gratification. It's saying no to what is what you would like to say yes to in the moment for some better, longer-term, longer-lasting good.
That's why I skipped dinner tonight.
That's why you skipped dinner tonight.
To be here.
Yes, I was going to wonder if we picked up the growls of your innards in the mics. If you hear anything like that, it is actually Scott, and he skipped dinner to be here. So you better pay attention, and you better love it. Like it, love it, share it, subscribe, all that cool stuff. So, but he says...
And I could not be bribed with ice cream.
And you could not. I actually did try to bribe him with ice cream. So you really want to look good in a bathing suit or something. But summer's over.
Try not to be expedient.
Try not to be expedient. Okay, well. So he kind of starts out, he's like, the one who confronts Jesus has to be the opposite of good. It has to be evil. It has to be Satan. And then he tempts Jesus, who is hungry, with bread. Hey, turn these things into bread. And then he suggests throwing himself on the cliff. And then he gives him, hey, look at all these kingdoms. All these I will give to you, the world's kingdoms, if you bow down and worship me. But Christ responds by saying, one does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Kind of what is he saying there? And I thought this was really, there's so many profound points in this second section here where I don't think we're going to get all of them, but it's worth a read, if worth a reread or a read. But he says that even under conditions of extreme privation or deprivation, there are more important things than food. So again, pursue what is meaningful, not what is expedient. Put another way, bread is of little use to the man who has betrayed his soul, even if he is currently starving. And there's this note, little star asterisk, that points to something at the bottom of the page here. And he says, for anyone who thinks this is somehow unrealistic, given the concrete material reality and genuine suffering that is associated with privation, I would once again recommend Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which contains a series of exceptionally profound discussions about proper ethical behavior and its exaggerated rather than diminished importance in situations of extreme want and suffering, right? So this idea that you think, oh, well, there's a point where what's expedient is actually more important. Like you have to stay alive. You got to get something to eat. And he is saying, and he's referring to this guy Solzhenitsyn, who spent lots of time in Russian prison camps. And he says, no, actually, it's more important to do what is meaningful, not what is expedient, to do what is right, not what is convenient, or not immediate gratification. So obviously Jesus could make bread there, but he goes into this. Christ could clearly use his near infinite power, as Satan indicates, to gain bread now, to break his fast, even in the broader sense, to gain wealth in the world, which would theoretically solve the problem of bread more permanently. But at what cost? And to what gain? Gluttony in the midst of moral desolation? That's the poorest and most miserable of feasts. Christ aims, therefore, at something higher, at the description of a mode of being that would finally and forever solve the problem of hunger. If we all chose instead of expedience to dine on the Word of God, that would require each and every person to live and produce and sacrifice and speak and share in a manner that would permanently render the privation of hunger a thing of the past. And that's how the problem of hunger in the privations of the desert is most truly and finally addressed, right? So yes, you have these moments where it's like really, really hard to do the meaningful thing and the important thing, where it's really, really hard to resist the easy path. But that's perhaps when it's most important. And wow, just like that idea that saying no to real physical, earthly, bodily bread and saying yes to the Word of God is actually the thing that, I mean, we're really missing. Right? That it would unlock answers to problems that are far more significant, with answers that are far longer lasting and more permanent, right? I don't know if you remember this part of it or not, but I mean, this whole thing about the temptation of Jesus, the way he kind of digs into it is supremely profound. Just reading it again, like, I can't believe we didn't spend any time talking about this last time.
We didn't get that far, I guess.
We didn't get that far.
Yeah, so, I mean, I can see that not even in the desert, right? Even in our middle classness, right? So we have a comfortable life. You know, if we continued to try to do, which, you know, you may have gotten to that point by doing something not expedient, right? Not taking the quick way out. You may have gotten to that level in your life where you're comfortable. And now that you're there, you're almost in a desert of another sort, where if tempted to, you know, having to give up some, you know, other creature comforts at this point and go back to some state that you were before.
Mm-hmm.
No, I don't want to do that. You know, that's my initial instinct, right?
Well, we live in the Gulf Coast area where we are regularly reminded of what it's like to live without creature comforts when we lose power and storms come through. And unfortunately, there are obviously a lot of people dealing with that kind of stuff right now. But, you know, I think that's part of this, right? Like giving up something that we want right now so that we can do something that is more of a long-term answer, right? And if we're helping people in other storm-ravaged places, unexpectedly so, North Carolina, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, aren't we then also helping ourselves later on in our own situations where, I mean, we experience that stuff far more often, This is kind of a freak thing for some of the places that have been affected by this. But actually, it's kind of the reverse this time. I mean, they have done a lot for us.
Right.
Because we always seemed, our area, the Gulf Coast, tends to be an area that has gotten a lot of these types of things. And so now it's, hey, let's turn it around. I got an email today from our district president saying, hey, they have always been very helpful for us, so let's do this. Let's help. So you are helping yourself even when you think you're not. You're depriving yourself. You're pursuing something other than what seems to be most obvious and most expedient, and it achieves something far greater. And hey, forget bread altogether. Pursuing the Word of God. If you don't do that, then you don't get this idea, and then you wind up all alone in your trial, your time of trial and disaster, right? That makes sense. I don't know if maybe I was reaching too hard to connect all that stuff, but when you were talking, it just made me think of all that. So, And then throw yourself off the cliff, Satan says, offering the next temptation. If God exists, he'll save you. Why would God not make himself manifest to rescue his only begotten Son from hunger and isolation and the presence of great evil? But that doesn't establish, that establishes no pattern for life. It doesn't even work as literature. The emergence of a divine force that magically rescues the hero from his predicament is the cheapest trick in the hack writer's playbook. It makes a mockery of independence and courage and destiny and free will and responsibility. Furthermore, God is in no wise a safety net for the blind. He's not someone to be commanded to perform magic tricks or forced into self-revelation, not even by his own Son. And Jesus responds, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Christ does not casually order or even dare ask God to intervene on his behalf. He refuses to dispense with his responsibility for the events of his own life. He refuses to demand that God prove his presence. He refuses as well to solve the problems of moral vulnerability in a merely personal manner by compelling God to save him, because that would not solve the problem for everyone else and for all time, right? So the way to save everyone is not to jump off and, hey, look, God saved me. I'm the guy. No, the way to save everyone is to go to the cross and allow people to do what they're going to do. And the same thing with the final temptation, right? It's, hey, here's all the kingdoms of the earth. He's offered this, what everyone wants. Everyone to bow at their feet, right? All the money, all the wealth, all the power, everything you could possibly imagine. That he said, that's expedience writ large, right? Just snap your finger. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, king or whatever. But that's not all. Such expansion of status also provides unlimited opportunity for the inner darkness to reveal itself. The lust for blood, rape, and destruction is very much part of power's attraction. It is not that men desire power so that they will no longer suffer. It is not only that they desire power so that they can overcome subjugation to want, disease, and death. Power also means the capacity to take vengeance, ensure submission, and crush enemies. Grant Cain enough power, and he will not only kill Abel, he will torture him first, imaginatively and endlessly. Then and only then will he kill him. Then he will come after everyone else. Yeah. And that's something we mentioned Solzhenitsyn. There's a part of the writing that he shared after he went through years in this prison camp. He tells this story of fantasizing, about things that the prison guards had done to him and to other people while he was in there. And he found himself fantasizing about what he would do if the tables were turned or when the tables are turned. right? Like, oh man, am I going to enjoy doing that back to them? And then there's this relatively famous line. And that's when I knew, and I'm paraphrasing, I don't know if this is exactly it, but pretty close. He said, and that's when it dawned on him, that's when he had this realization that the line between good and evil runs right through the human heart. You know, so, but that's what he's offering Jesus. That's what Satan is offering Jesus. He's like, hey, you can have it all. But that ultimately doesn't solve the problems.
That's why in comic books, Superman and Batman have the no-kill rule, right? They were, well, not so much Superman, I guess, but Batman, became Batman because his parents were killed. And then, you know, he thought through his life of all the ways he's going to seek revenge. And then at the time when he has that opportunity, he doesn't take it. I know there's some movie variations of that don't include that. They let him go ahead and wreak havoc on people. But
yeah,
that was kind of a thing that he realized that he couldn't. If he did, you know, what they did, then he is basically no better than they were.
Mm-hmm.
And the world has not gotten any better. So
yeah,
he didn't do the expedient thing when he could have, I guess.
Yeah. No, that's it is a far more difficult thing than we often realize. To return what has been done to us is really a deep desire of every human heart. You know? I mean, it's instinctive. It happens. And so it requires this like restraint that has to be a lot tougher than you might imagine initially. But that's why everybody wants, you know, it's like even if we withhold revenge, there is still an element of us longing for it by striving for the pinnacle. He goes into this little thing about reaching this pinnacle. That may be part of why we don't actually take out revenge is because we aren't yet fully, we haven't reached the top. We haven't reached that place that Satan has offered to Jesus where we have the authority and the power to do it without repercussions, right? So maybe we don't take revenge because we know we're going to look bad and it'll come back to us later. But imagine if we didn't, right? Imagine if that wasn't the case. Imagine, you got everything and no one's coming after you because, and you could just unleash your own personal wrath. Well, then of course we would take it out on people that we could, that's the line between good and evil goes right through the middle of the human heart. There's this interesting, I don't know if this is like a poem or something. Tao Te Ching. I don't know who that is. He who contrives defeats his purpose, and he who is grasping loses. The sage does not contrive to win, and therefore is not defeated. He is not grasping, so does not lose. So very like Eastern sounding, kind of thing. But isn't that true? Like, not that you shouldn't try for things, but this striving, this contriving, constantly. I mean, I find myself doing that a lot. That's why it hit me, that little snippet. Like, oh man, you're not gonna feel like you're losing all the time if you're not trying to win. You're not letting things aren't slipping through your grasp if you're not like constantly doing this. And isn't that really what Jesus is being offered here? Like, that's inside us wanting it to be perfect and everything, and have our reputation be whatever it is that we want it to be. I don't know. Does that make sense, or is that too much of a leap?
Yeah, it's hard to get there, yeah. I was thinking about football philosophies of coaching, right? You used to have this old school where you're going to line up and you're just going to inflict pain on the other team.
Maximum pain.
Right, to win. Because you're going to win. So we're just going to pound them to submission, right? And then you'll have some coaches, I think Nick Saban is one of those, that no, you do every play, you play your position, you do, you take every step, you block the way you're supposed to block, and then if everybody else does what they're supposed to do your job, then the play is successful. And if you keep doing that, you win. Not I'm pounding the other person or pounding whatever to win.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you might have to pound somebody to do your job, but, it's not, I don't know. That popped into my head when you were saying that. So you keep moving forward. You keep trying, you keep working to do your best. Don't take a cheap shot, maybe, which would be expedient.
Yeah.
To take out maybe the other team's quarterback. Yeah, you might win, but did you really win? You beat the other team without their best player, maybe, or something.
Yeah. Well, and then you have the Saints and their targeting scandal, right? But then, I don't know I'm not thinking of all the specific examples, but I do know that, personally, if I've tried too hard, like to swing a bat, hit a ball, right? You're trying to crush it. You never hit it, right? Golf, same way, which I'm terrible. But yeah, you try too hard, trying to crush it, try to hit the home run, try to win, you lose. I don't know if that, whenever we had to, you ended up in like wrestling or, like in the different things in gym class, they're trying to teach all these different things. Or sometimes things get out of hand on the playground or whatever. I always found that it was the people and myself too, where if you are like furious and you're like, I'm going to go get him, that person always looked like a fool. But if you just kind of laid back and waited, and let them look like a fool, and then you kind of pounce and react and you play your game, right? Not let the other team make you play their game. That's how you win. Actually win. But I think, I don't know if, well, yeah.
I don't know if that fits into all that.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. Like, did we just undo it all? Because he does go here. He says, it's the description of that special sacrifice that has preoccupied the Christian and more than the Christian imagination for centuries. Why has it not had the desired effect? Why do we remain unconvinced that there is no better plan than lifting our eyes skyward, aiming at the good, and sacrificing everything to that ambition? Have we merely failed to understand, or have we fallen willfully or otherwise off the path? Like, we're still not, we're still trying to win. I don't know. So this next Christianity and its problems takes up the next, goodness, how many pages? It goes into something else, but it's really all kind of wrestling with this. So this idea that Christianity has at its core is sacrifice. The epitome of pursuing what is meaningful, not expedient. That's why he's gone into this thing with Jesus and the temptation, because ultimately by giving up all of those kingdoms that have been offered to him, he actually gets a far greater kingdom. And he goes to the cross, which is far more painful and miserable than just jumping off that cliff, but also far more effective. And this idea of sacrifice becomes something that permeates the entirety of Western civilization. And he talks about Carl Jung and Friedrich Nietzsche and all these ideas that kind of just really throw a lot of shade at Christianity and the church. And he actually, I think, does a really good job of defending Christianity and the church as we know it as an institution. He goes into some background and how they kind of got there. But essentially, Christianity's problems are only problems because there's a quote here. Let me read it. This is not to say that Christianity was without its problems, but it is more appropriate to note that they were the sort of problems that emerge only after an entirely different set of more serious problems has been solved. Right? So this idea that Christianity solves some of the world's worst problems. The society produced by Christianity is far less barbaric than the pagan, even the Roman ones it replaced. Christian society at least recognized that feeding slaves to ravenous lions for the entertainment of the populace was wrong, even if many barbaric practices still existed. It objected to infanticide, to prostitution, and to the principle that might means right. It insisted that women were as valuable as men, even though we are still working out how to manifest that insistence politically. It demanded that even a society's enemies be regarded as human. Finally, it separated church from state so that all too human emperors could no longer claim the veneration due to gods. All of this was asking the impossible, but it happened. Wow. He goes into a bit about a little depth into slavery, a little bit before that, and maybe after that as well. But isn't that true? I mean, for all the problems that the church has, and he does go into those.
It's the best alternative that we have.
Yeah, there's nothing else
we've had so far.
You can't complain about it until you have it for hundreds of years, thousands, right?
I think we even see that nowadays in this country that was, basic, that was built on those concepts. And so many generations have grown up in that environment that they don't even realize, they want to argue about where did that really come from? Were these guys really Christian? Were they theists, or were they this or that, or whatever they were? But, and want to talk about all the ills of the government and such, which there are, but where else would you go that it's any better?
Yep.
And you're trying to replace it with something. You're like, seems to be a trend lately where they're trying to replace it with systems there seems to be a desire, or at least concepts anyway, of things that have been proven to be failures.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to, replace what we have now. Yeah, no, that's not the right answer. Work on our issues, the less impactful issues that we have now than what we could have if we went some other route completely.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there is no solution. There's no solution that is better. It's most of all the solutions that have been presented essentially put us back into these things that are proven to be failures, and not just failures, but colossal failures. And he kind of goes into how the 20th century, was actually where these movements started. I mean, Nietzsche is like, it's a long time ago. It's not yesterday.
Right.
And it sort of gives some traction to what becomes Nazism and Stalinism and all of the atrocities and horrors of that period of the 20th century. Like just, and I've said this before. I know people don't like to give to churches. I know people don't like to be committed to churches. It's not cool to. I feel that pull myself. Like, hey, what I do is not really all that important, and I have to be careful not to overstate things or over ask. Demand more than really is necessary because, well, you're just this institution. This isn't really Jesus. This isn't really church. All that kind of stuff, but. Over the last year or two, I've had a few moments where I've said either this or versions of this, like, hey, I know we have this pull. We have this inner turmoil about whether we really like the church that we say we like. How do I know? Because of the lack of commitment financially and otherwise, right? But is the world better off with places like this? Yes. I think unambiguously, yes. And anyone that says otherwise just has an axe to grind and hasn't gotten over the fact they need Jesus, really. They think they had enough of Jesus, but really I would say they had enough of religiosity. They had enough of a warped sense of Christianity and Jesus. And really what they need is Jesus, because they're going to tear down a whole lot of bad stuff out of spite and out of anger and animosity and revenge and probably rightly so, the people that did whatever they did to them under the banner of Christianity, it's despicable. It's just absolutely despicable. And I completely get why they feel that way, because those sorts of things make me almost as angry as they are. Right. I just know that it's a false version. It's not Jesus. It's not Christianity. It's not biblical Christianity. Jesus had problems with religious people too, but he still pointed people to God, and he still called them to gather, and he still called them to do all these other things that Christians have been doing with some degree of success, sometimes more, sometimes less, but with some degree of success. So the world is better off with these things. No one has a solution of what to do instead. So get over it and just support your local church and your pastor and your brothers and sisters in Christ and your community in and through your church, right? Just get over it already. Just do it, okay? And if it's a church that really burned you, then find another one, because we need them, and they don't exist without you, like without people committed to it.
Right.
There is no pastor that takes a church and just, builds it up, resurrects it. It's a bunch of other people that take, like you were talking about, everybody does their job, right? Mm-hmm. The Nick Saban model. You do your job well. The person next to you does their job well. And all the people, right, they do their job well. The play succeeds, and we move down the field, right? I have a job to do. I have an important job to do, and one that gets a lot more attention because I stand up in front of people and I say a lot of stuff and all these things, right? But that doesn't mean I'm the only essential person to this whole thing. It's each and every one of us. And I would say, myself included, we don't acknowledge that often enough. Pastors don't acknowledge that often enough. Take it for granted and don't say thanks as often as we probably should to the people that are there, Mm-hmm. In my defense, stuff happens very quickly, one fire to the next. It's hard to...
No, you shouldn't be doing it to necessarily get a thank you, right? You should be doing it because that's what you should be doing.
Yes, absolutely. We'll be studying that as we go through the rest of the Sermon on the Mount in the next few weeks. But
There's a good plug for the
Doesn't mean
for Sunday.
come on out, brothers and sisters, seeking the kingdom. We're going through the Sermon on the Mount. Come on down and get slapped around spiritually for an hour or so. I mean, that's kind of what it feels like with the Sermon on the Mount. It's just, I mean, it raises the bar just beyond what humans typically think is possible, you know. So it is tough. This week in particular, I mean, I had a hard time I'm just wrestling with it, trying to figure out how to say this because I know it's going to piss off a lot of people. And I'm like, but that's why we do. That's why we just go through it.
Hello, good morning, open arms.
Good morning. If you would like, want to save yourself about an hour and 15 minutes, just come on up here. I got a paddle, and I'm just going to give you a good whack, and you can leave. Should we do that? It might be easier.
It'll have an impact, but it won't be the same impact.
Yeah, no, we're not going to do that. But so Christianity does have its problems.
Yeah, I've heard him say a few times interviewing people or discussing on some of his podcasts about, people start pointing out all the problems with the church. And then he'll say, "Oh yeah, buddy, you got something better?
Mm-hmm.
What you got? Don't look like it's working so well."
Yeah.
And he has a much more, a better way of saying it than I did, but it's a classic when you hear him say it.
Yeah. Well, he's got one example, the fact that automobiles pollute only becomes a problem of sufficient magnitude to attract public attention when the far worse problems that the internal combustion engine solves have vanished from view. People stricken with poverty don't care about carbon dioxide. It's not precisely that CO2 levels are irrelevant. It's that they're irrelevant when you're working yourself to death, starving, scraping a bare living from the stony, unyielding, thorn and thistle-infested ground. It's that they're irrelevant until after the tractor is invented and hundreds of millions stop starving.
Or you stop dying from cholera because the animals are, leaving their prizes behind on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And the diseases, all that. So, yeah, there's all kind of aspects of that. But, yeah, that's very...
So he talks about Nietzsche described himself with no serious overstatement as philosophizing with a hammer. His devastating critique of Christianity, already weakened by its conflict with the very science to which it had given rise, involved two main lines of attack. Nietzsche claimed first that it was precisely the sense of truth developed in the highest sense by Christianity itself that ultimately came to question and then to undermine the fundamental presuppositions of the faith. That was partly because the difference between moral or narrative truth and objective truth had not yet been fully comprehended, and so an opposition was presumed where none necessarily exist. But that does not belie the point. Even when the modern atheists oppose Christianity, belittle fundamentalists for insisting, for example, that the creation account in Genesis is objectively true, they are using their sense of truth, highly developed over the centuries of Christian culture, to engage in such argumentation. So Christianity creates science, and then science kind of attacks Christianity, but science is using the things that Christianity essentially provided in order to try to critique Christianity. I think that's it, that spot there in a nutshell. Carl Jung continued to develop Nietzsche's argument decades later, pointing out that Europe awoke during the Enlightenment as if from a Christian dream, noticing that everything it had heretofore taken for granted could and should be questioned. God is dead, said Nietzsche. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we, murderers of all murderers, console ourselves? That which was the holiest and mightiest of all that the world had yet possessed has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? Right? So, like, what are we going to do now? And he, like the hammer that just sort of all right, we're just going to smash this thing. And I think we're still kind of, I don't know if we've really fully moved on to a new way of, he's so foundational in the modern thought. I'm not up to date on all this stuff. Where are we moving now? And how is it going to be helpful or not helpful? And how do we respond to that? I don't know. But
Well, they had that movement a few years, and I guess it's still going, the new atheist movement. And from what I understand from listening to some of it was religion is the whole problem with the world, because, the different religions don't agree or they all think they're the only one, of course, whatever. But that's, so then it winds up with wars and, all that type of thing, right? But their concept was we don't need that anymore. We've learned enough. We're intelligent enough. We could sit around and we could come up with the rules, the logical rules for a society without a religion.
Well, but then you have Soviet Union, you have communist China and all the atrocities. And so clearly, yes, you do need religion.
So what happened? But what happens when you sit around and you come up with all these rules that are logical? You've basically just created another religion.
It's just, it's not based on fact, scientifically speaking, right? It's a preconceived set of beliefs and values that you sort of just believe because you believe them. And really, in some ways, actually, that points to a God, that we have a lot of similar ideas about all these things.
Objective.
Yeah. So this next part here, I think, is something that we really need to take seriously. These are the critiques of Nietzsche at the time that were and are still very much justified, I would say, and that are echoed by people today. And I don't know that that's because he said these things 100 years ago. I think people actually experience this and go, yeah, we're Christians. Like, where are they on this? Like, why is this a thing? So he says that Paul and later the Protestants following Luther had removed moral responsibility from Christ's followers. They had watered down the idea of the imitation of Christ. This imitation was the sacred duty of the believer not to adhere or merely to mouth a set of statements about abstract belief, but instead to actually manifest the spirit of the Savior in the particular, specific conditions of his or her life, to realize or incarnate the archetype, as Jung had it, to clothe the eternal pattern in flesh. Nietzsche writes, "The Christians have never practiced the actions Jesus prescribed them, and the impudent, garrulous talk about the justification by faith and its supreme and sole significance is only the consequence of the church's lack of courage and will to profess the works Jesus demanded." So, basically, this idea that we are saved by grace through faith, which is true. It's true. I'm a Lutheran. I believe that. I believe the Bible says that. But the emphasis on it in, post-Reformation, Enlightenment, Christianity has created a bunch of people who don't even try to look like Jesus.
Right.
And so part of us going through the Sermon on the Mount is, yeah, I get that. I recognize that, and I see that in myself. I read a book, The Patient Ferment, something about the early church. And it really, the historical accounts and writings, they are chock full of evidence that the Christians were fundamentally focused on right behavior. So they didn't write books to defend why they believed what they believed. So there weren't people like Ken Ham trying to defend a particular view of the creation account or Genesis, right? There weren't people like that. There were people writing books that said, this is why we only have sex with our spouse. This is why we care for the poor. This is why we don't retaliate against our enemies. This is why we forgive people that hurt us. This is why we let them throw us to the lions. Those were the things that they wrote about.
Interesting.
This is why we don't allow soldiers in some cases. They wouldn't allow certain kinds of people at the time. I think I'm not advocating that position necessarily, but those are the things that they wrote about. Because it was not up here. It was like in your life, your behavior. Their goal was to live a life that was so beautiful and shocking to the outside world that they went, why do you act like that? Mm-hmm. Which ultimately would lead to, what do you believe? But the fundamental question wasn't, why do you believe what you believe, but why do you act the way you act? And that's what changed the world. That's how Christianity became what it became, because people were attracted to that life. Slaves are attracted to a religion that says everybody is valued, right? And everybody has a place in the family of God and rights of inheritance and all this other kind of stuff. Women are attracted to groups of people that say that at that time, of course, the wife was only supposed to be in bed with her husband, but the husband was allowed to do whatever he wanted. Well, women are attracted to organizations or communities of people where the men are doing what they're supposed to do as well, you know? And that's why, for example, one of the reasons why I've wanted actually to do something on the Sermon on the Mount for a long time, because the early Christians, that was like, they spent all the time. They were always in this book. In that
so they didn't
section.
go around to the Greeks and say, we believe what we believe because the earth was created in 7 days, 6 days and a day of rest, and that's why that's the most important thing to know.
It is definitely not.
And they'd have probably went,
yeah.
What?
Yeah, it would have been totally irrelevant. And frankly, it is irrelevant to most people today. They don't. That's not what's going to get someone who doesn't believe to believe. I'm not saying that God didn't do it in 7 days or that he couldn't have done it in 7 days. I'm just saying from a mission perspective, from a witness to the world perspective, it's irrelevant.
Right. They probably say, well, that's an interesting concept, but
yeah,
whatever. That's not why I'm.
The bigger point would be that God created.
Right.
That this is something incredible, just baffling the human brain to even try to consider how this whole thing came together and the intricacies of the human body and of different naturally occurring substances and chemicals and plants and animals and ecosystems and all these things that just work. Even though they don't always work, right? And then that's part of the story. It's like, oh, well, why don't things work? Well, is it really evolution, or is it the entrance of some foreign force, sin, right, that disrupts all of this, which leads to this idea of, meaningful versus expedience, right? Like, that was the expedient thing. Like, hey, I want that now. I want knowledge of good and evil. I want to be free of all restrictions. And they do that, but then what does that do? It's a long-term loss for everyone,
That was that was a very expedient thing.
Mm-hmm. She saw that it was, desirable to eat, and she, knowledge, and there it was, done. And Adam, who was with her, watching the whole time.
Yeah, Jordan Peterson, they always try to back him into, is he a Christian or not a Christian? And, he gives an answer or something. I'm not going to be able to try to paraphrase it that, like I try. It's
yeah. I try to live as if God exists.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's not like an oath you take or a magic incantation that you say. Not that you shouldn't say, say words that you believe in Jesus as the Son of God and God created the, everything and all that. Not that you shouldn't say that, but that's not a magic spell that just suddenly does it, right? That's just like the beginning of it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of it is living it as if you believe it.
Yeah. And I think, after reading this and you kind of just bringing that up now, it's like, that's probably why he says it the way he says it. This right here.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's read this guy, he's studied it, he understands it, and he doesn't want to be a part of this, like, well, I believe, and this comes out in James, the book of James, right? Even the demons believe and shudder. So believing, and then James talks about, hey, even Abraham was justified by his works. Now, I would say that it's faith, but that faith was made manifest in the fact that God said to go, so he went.
Mm-hmm.
Is there, if he'd have not gone, he would have not been Abraham. But was Abraham always faithful? No. So, it is faith that saves, but faith, what you really believe does affect what you do. And it's a nasty, tricky, kind of complicated mess for us to unwind. But I think we all know that to be true. That doesn't mean that because you believe certain things that you're going to nail it every time. But we should, it's not nothing. We should evaluate this all the time. And I think this is where Tim Keller was always very helpful for me, because he talks like, well, yeah, you sin, but why don't you have growth? Why don't you have spiritual transformation? And one of his big things is, well, because we don't ever think about why we sinned. Like, why did we do that? Well, because there's another God that we have that we may not be recognizing or acknowledging as God in our lives, but we believe fundamentally at a deeper level than we may realize that our job is most important, or our reputation is most important, or having the approval of a certain group of people is important, or having the approval of everybody is important, or, money or whatever, right? And because of that, then we do things that get those things for us and serve those things rather than what God would have us do.
I was trying to look up a quote to see. Because we always talk about movies and how they imitate, or the story. And so here we go.
Yeah.
Here we go. Batman. It's not what I am underneath, but what I do that defines me. Was Batman right, or? Would that fit? I don't know.
Well, what you are underneath, it ultimately becomes what you do, right? So he's just going the other way. I would say that's the other extreme, right? It's not to say that, oh, I am what I am underneath, not what I do, which is the way people are trying to get all kinds of criminals off the hook. Oh, well, they've just been through so much. Yeah, but Jordan Peterson, actually, I think I watched a video of him not that long ago. It's like, yeah, well, there are a lot of people that have been through a lot. What gives you special reason to be such a dirtbag? I mean, he didn't say it like that. I'm saying
It's
that.
probably pretty close to that, though.
Yeah. Who are you? You don't get an excuse. Nobody else has that excuse.
Right.
Or they have the excuse, but they don't use that. So go to jail and pay the price because you did it.
But I guess what I take out of that quote is I'm not who I say that I am. It's what I do that defines me. Right. That's kind of the way I interpreted that quote.
So that's a slightly different. So that's what this is like Christians saying one thing and doing other things. Right? That's what our biggest challenge really is. But the original quote, I'm not what I am underneath, but what I do. I think it's actually what you do proves what you really are underneath.
Okay,
Not
that's
not
not the way I took it.
Not what you say you are underneath.
Right.
I don't know.
That's not the way I took it when I heard the quote. That's why it stuck with me because, we know we're not perfect people, so it's not who I am that defines me, but what I do. Right. So if I do good, if I do what God asked me to do, that's more of who I am, or at least I'm trying to be something better than what I am.
But see, there's a danger in that, though, too, because then you convince yourself you're good, but you're really filthy, disgusting, awful underneath, because we can get into the Grand Inquisitor story here.
Okay.
Because your assessment of what's good has been lowered so that you can look and say, oh, look at what I did, therefore I'm good, even though you're not.
But it was you just said it was a credit to, Abraham for his,
that's James too. Yeah.
All right. So he's basically saying the same thing.
What he did, yeah.
I mean, he's saying it about himself, I guess. If somebody else said it about him, he's a criminal because he does these things. Well, no, he's really good because he gets that credited to him because he saved all these people.
I think it's a muddy mess. That's the point. So ultimately, this is where Christianity will stumble. Right. Because it is completely the grace of God that saves us, the work of Jesus, because nothing we ever do will truly be what is necessary for us to enter the kingdom of heaven. But that doesn't mean we just do whatever the heck we want. Right. And I would actually say, if we really believed what we say we believe, it would change what we do.
Right.
And so really, and this is kind of like a Lutheran approach, I would say, is that what we really need to know is to really know just how much God loves us and how much His grace does and how much His grace means. And that is what ultimately gets us away from the striving and the winning stuff from before, right? Because that's why we do all kinds of stuff. We're climbing over people to get somewhere. But if we don't have to climb over people to get to achieve some certain thing, well, now we can actually stop and look around and serve our neighbor. That's a Lutheran, I would say, understanding of it. Two kinds of righteousness. So there's a passive vertical righteousness, us and God. That's righteous only in Christ. God looks at us, and through faith in Christ, through baptism, He sees Jesus. We're clothed in the righteousness of Christ, Galatians 3:27. But then there's this horizontal, active righteousness. People in this world consider us righteous based on what we do, based on how we serve our neighbor, how we are reliable, how we keep our word, how we all that other kind of stuff. So there are consequences for what we do in relation to other people, but that ultimately can't get us in.
Right.
But it should be a result of this righteousness from Christ given freely to us becomes a mechanism to go, oh, well, I don't have to try and get in good with God anymore. Maybe I should serve my neighbor. You know, I don't know if that helps clarify it at all, but this is a huge piece. This isn't the only thing that he talks about. He actually says that dogmatic belief in the central axioms of Christianity, that Christ's crucifixion redeemed the world, that salvation was reserved for the hereafter, that salvation could not be achieved through works, had three mutually reinforcing consequences. First, devaluation of the significance of earthly life, as only the hereafter mattered. This also meant that it had become acceptable to overlook and shirk responsibility for the suffering that existed in the here and now. That's what we're doing today. That's what modern people, right? Sort of, shirking responsibility, right? We're having problems with this now.
Mm-hmm.
Second, passive acceptance of the status quo, because salvation could not be earned in any case through effort in this life. Talks about Marx and the opiate of the masses, right? That, whatever. This life sucks and we're looking at something better anyway, so no reason to get worked up about all these problems. Is that what the early church did? No, they attacked those things. I mean, they went after them. And finally, third, the right of the believer to reject any real moral burden outside of the stated belief in salvation through Christ, because the Son of God had already done all the important work. It was for such reasons that Dostoevsky, who was a great influence on Nietzsche, also criticized institutional Christianity, although he arguably managed it in a more ambiguous but also more sophisticated manner. So we got our eyes on heaven, not on the earth. This is John Lennon, right? Imagine all the people living for today. I hope I don't get disconnected, because I'm sure I'm pitch perfect on that. Right there, heads in the clouds. What about now? What about here? What about the real people, real problems, real situations? Stop worrying about what may or may not come. That's still a big problem. And the status quo, I mean, holy cow. It many churches and church leaders are content to just let things be, not stand up and say this is wrong because it's uncomfortable, it's difficult, all these things. It just rather just inertia, just things in motion stay in motion, things at rest stay at rest. It's just let it be and let it do what it does. And I've fallen prey to that. And sometimes I would say maybe it's actually the right response as well. But there's this story, the Grand Inquisitor from the brothers Karamazov. We got two brothers. One is an atheist, one's a monk or training to be a monk, and the guy who's an atheist really is ticked off at the monk brother and the church that he represents, and he tells him this story, the Grand Inquisitor, and it's a fictional story about what it would be like if Jesus returned during the Spanish Inquisition. He'd come back, he'd do all the stuff that he does, the good stuff, the healing, the love, the care and concern for people, the compassion. But ultimately that would piss off church leaders, and they would have him arrested. And they do in this story that he's telling. And the Grand Inquisitor has Jesus arrested, thrown into a prison cell, and he eventually pays him a visit. He informs Christ that he's no longer needed. His return is simply too great a threat to the church. The inquisitor tells Christ that the burden he laid on mankind, the burden of existence in faith and truth, was simply too great for mere mortals to bear. The inquisitor claims that the church, in its mercy, diluted that message, lifting the demand for perfect being from the shoulders of its followers, providing them instead with the simple and merciful escapes of faith and the afterlife. That work took centuries, says the inquisitor, and the last thing the church needs after all that effort is the return of the man who insisted the people bear all the weight in the first place. Christ listens in silence. Then as the inquisitor turns to leave, Christ embraces him and kisses him on the lips. The inquisitor turns white in shock. Then he goes out, leaving the cell door open. So this is where, like, what we do and the great, like, you got to have perfection. That's why we're doing the Sermon on the Mount. You don't get off the hook for anything there. Nobody makes it through the Sermon on the Mount and goes, oh, I got it. I'm good. Pat yourself on the back.
Yeah, you thought the 10 Commandments were tough.
Let
Let
me give you something new, boys and girls. Let me tell you what they were really about in the first place. And that is the danger in what we do being the focus, right? That the church, ultimately, people that emphasize that have to make the bar hittable or achievable. And when they do that, they really keep Christ out. They basically have to abandon his actual teaching. And that's the critique that's being kind of leveled here through this story. But Jesus does what Jesus does. He loves this guy anyway. And then somehow it does something in him. He leaves the door open, and that's an idea that he's making this critique in the book and in the story that the church is an absolute train wreck. The church is responsible for so much hypocrisy and evil and all this kind of stuff, and doing everything to essentially eliminate Jesus from it. And yet somehow he's still there. Like, the door is still open. He isn't handed over to the executioner. He isn't completely removed from the institution, the church, right? And this is where, aren't we better off with churches and not churches? Like, somehow the church is still the primary way, I would say, that people see Jesus and get to know Jesus. And what do you do if they're all gone? I don't know. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good at all. But I told you I had a conversation with another pastor earlier, right, Eric, and I shared that story for both of us, that it was a helpful reminder to me that even though what we do seems so useless sometimes, somehow Jesus is still in it, still working. So, well, we found a way to not fully attack everything in the last half here, but spent plenty of time doing it.
Very good stuff.
You grunted and nodded and even included a couple of quotes here and there.
I'm amazed I was able to even attempt that. So
no, it was good. It was good. But we should probably let you eat. I haven't heard any growls in a while. Did it start
swimming around,
digesting your small intestine or something?
Probably need to fast a little bit. So
I hear it's very good for you.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, y'all, hang in there, and don't give up on the church yet. Yeah, it seems like what you're doing is useless, whether you're a pastor or a lay leader or just a church goer or church contributor in every way, shape, or form. Jesus is still there. I don't know. Maybe there are better ones. You should work towards or move towards. But
And if we're not doing it right, come help us to do it right.
yeah, come on out, help us. I mean, because good luck finding anything like this anywhere else. I mean, they have the same problems too.
All right.
Same problems. And churches actually, because of the message of grace and love and the equality in value of all people, we attract some really terrible people. So you got to give us a break. Like, the people that are the worst are attracted to it first, and they have the longest way to go. So come on out and help us grow.
It's like
Personally, spiritually, not like numbers. I don't mean it like that. I mean, help us to become who we should be and can be.
like your quote from last week, huh? What is wrong with the world?
I am. Yeah, I am. G.K. Chesterton, Gilbert Keith Chesterton. Got some more quotes of his I could probably share, but time to go.
Time for another day, huh?
Time for another day, y'all. All right. See these publications here? Please take a look. They're great. They're fantastic. Very high quality. I'm not just saying that. And like and share and subscribe and all that good